don't need a microphone. Switch on. You want this one? Get it on as a switch. And did you do the intro?
Yeah, I'm gonna do the intro. Yes, and we talked about that. Hello, everybody.
I keep reading.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Hi. Okay. We're going to wait just a few minutes to get started to give everybody a chance to log on. Heather, while we're waiting before we start, is there a PowerPoint or anything that we want to make sure? I want to make sure that you can also share your screen.
Sure. Yeah, no, I didn't, based on our
Oh,
conversation,
I
didn't
cannot
do.
hear you. Let me check the speaker in here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear. Can everyone hear? Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I did not do a PowerPoint. Based on our conversation, I wanted this to be more of a personal discussion about experiences. So you know, you can always hear about what the law is in immigration, and certainly that isn't something that is relevant necessarily for this. It's more about personal stories and some advice about how to get in, how to connect social work and law, or immigration law specifically.
Great. We are all looking forward to hearing from you and hearing about your experiences. And it's, let's see, it's 12:02 here. And we've got a pretty good crowd. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with your introduction so we can start. So I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. I'm really excited about Heather Ziemba being with us today. And I'm going to do a brief introduction. And Heather, too, I invite you when you start, please share more just about your experience or where you went to school. We'd love to hear more about you. So Heather Ziemba is an immigration attorney for Legal Aid of North Carolina, a nonprofit organization in the Battered Immigrant Project, where she represents immigrant victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking in immigration matters. Ms. Ziemba has practiced immigration law exclusively since 1998 and is certified by the North Carolina Board of Legal Specialization as a specialist in immigration law. She has been recognized by her peers for her expertise in immigration law and has been listed in Best Lawyers in America. She is regarded by her peers and clients for her willingness to take on challenging and complicated immigration matters before the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the Executive Office for Immigration Review, and the U.S. Federal Courts. Ms. Ziemba has also taught immigration law as an adjunct law professor. Ms. Ziemba began her career in immigration law as the founder and director of the Immigrant Justice Program of Legal Services of Southern Piedmont, now Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy, a nationally recognized nonprofit organization where she developed a reputation for zealous advocacy on behalf of her immigrant clients. In this capacity, Ms. Ziemba became recognized for her experience in representing immigrant victims of crime and human trafficking. Ms. Ziemba regularly speaks at legal conferences on U visas for victims of violent crimes and T visas for victims of human trafficking, including at the American Immigration Lawyers Association annual conference. She is often called upon by her colleagues to advise on their cases as well. As an associate attorney at one of the largest immigration law firms in the Southeast, she developed a successful and highly regarded removal defense practice where she became known for her tireless advocacy on behalf of foreign nationals facing removal from the United States. She has successfully represented immigrants in removal proceedings seeking cancellation of removal, adjustment of status to lawful permanent residency, and waivers of inadmissibility and deportability. Ms. Ziemba has also traveled extensively throughout Central America and Mexico and is fluent in Spanish. So I know just reading through all the things that you've accomplished, Heather, we're very excited to hear from you today. We are very grateful that you were able to be with us and grateful that Dr. Harden connected us with you. So we welcome you and we look forward to hearing how you can talk with us about social workers being more active in advocacy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so exciting to be here because this is a discussion that for those of you who don't know, Dr. Harden is actually my cousin, and we've had this discussion about connecting our two careers for a long time, and this is the first time that we've actually done this, so I'm really excited and happy to see her face because it's been a while. And it is something that is kind of actually near and dear to my heart. I was telling Sarah, so I have been doing immigration almost exclusively since I graduated from law school. I actually went to Vanderbilt Law School, so not too far from you guys. And I now practice in North Carolina. But when I started getting into immigration, I've always known that I wanted to be sort of do social justice oriented law. And I initially started out going to law school thinking I wanted to be a child advocate. and I still am, but just a very limited group of children, immigrants specifically, but I specifically wanted to work with victims of sexual abuse and child abuse. And I went on a mission trip, actually. I started out as a staff attorney for our local Department of Social Services, representing families and representing the department in abuse and neglect cases and in guardianship and child support cases. But I went on a mission trip with my church to Mexico. And part of that program, which is called, it's Border Links, which is an amazing organization that teaches us about how our communities are connected along the border, particularly environmental, economic, social, and that part of that program was the idea of to bring back what we learned there and to help our own communities. And when I came back, it happened that there was a position open for a Spanish-speaking attorney with what was then known Legal Services of Southern Piedmont. And it was specifically to represent victims of domestic violence initially in proceedings obtaining protective orders and custody of their children and some ancillary issues. So I immediately decided that this was the perfect opportunity for me to link what I had learned on the Border Links program trip to my career, and convinced our director to seek funding to start an immigrant justice program that would serve the immigrant community, which was rapidly growing at that time. This was back in 1997. So, and is now well established in North Carolina. But, and at the beginning of that, I looked at different programs in larger cities that had a longer history of serving immigrants. And two of the programs that I looked at had not only a legal services component, but they had a social services component, and they had social workers on staff. And that was my dream. Unfortunately, back then, there was some very traditional thinking about legal services programs, where we're keeping social services, social work, and law separate. So I repeatedly kept trying to advocate to have social workers on staff. I was not successful at that time, but there has definitely been a change moving forward with that. And over the years, I have definitely seen the benefits of linking law and social work. It is intricately involved in the work that I do. And I always used to say that even though in representing victims of domestic violence, yes, I'm a lawyer, but there were so many ancillary issues that made it difficult sometimes for them to remain outside of that, to stay free of that domestic violence situation, that were not directly law issues, but were issues that were critical for the success of their legal case, including, finding housing, healthcare, childcare. All of those things are things that I found myself helping my clients with, even though I wasn't really qualified to do that. That wasn't in my wheelhouse. And that was one of the reasons why I felt like having social workers on staff of legal services organizations was critical to help with those ancillary issues and ensure the ongoing success of our clients. And so when I talked to Sarah, she talked about a couple of things that she really wanted me to talk about. And one of the things that I really wanted to share with you are specific stories about how social work has been involved in my work, to give you some ideas about how you might shape your career to work with immigrants and in the legal profession. And I can't tell you how often the types of cases I do, like as Sarah mentioned, I represent victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and human trafficking. So, and in addition to unaccompanied minors who come into the country without their parents, which has been a big issue. And I'm going to talk a little more about that when we talk about advocacy, because that's something else that Sarah asked me to talk about. And I'm going to leave time for questions for all of you as well. So don't worry about that. And if you have questions during this, feel free to type them in the chat and I'll try to respond accordingly. But so the first, just to give you a little background so you understand the types of cases that where you might play a role in immigration, which is, to be honest with you, is almost every kind of immigration case there is, except maybe some employment-based cases, but any type of humanitarian case, it is likely that you may be called upon, if you're working in a community of immigrants, to somehow supplement a case or provide services to your client that is directly related to their immigration matter. And as she mentioned about U visas, so U visas are visas that are for victims of violent crimes. It was primarily created for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. However, it can apply to other types of violent crimes that may not be related to a personal relationship with someone. Certain armed robberies or felonious assaults where people have been victims of very violent robberies, or have been maybe even a bystander of a drive-by shooting, certain things like that. It would apply to those situations. And with the U visas, one of the things that we have to show is that they suffered substantial hardships. And even if, there may be a situation where they were not physically injured, but there were severe mental consequences as a result of being a victim of this crime. And I have seen that. And so in those types of situations, just to give you an example of a case that I worked on, which also interacts, for those of you who are interested in working with children, I had a client, an 11-year-old girl who she was out with her uncle and they were carjacked at gunpoint, and the perpetrator pulled her out of the car and held the gun to her head. Now, she was not physically injured in any way, but obviously you can imagine that the mental injury to her is, particularly at her age, but for anyone, having that sense of safety taken away from them is very difficult. And so in that situation, we have two goals as attorneys. One is that we want to make sure our clients get assistance that they need to help their case, but we also want to make sure that we connect them with services that will help them move forward in a healthy manner. So as a social worker in that situation, even if you're not working, we have one social work intern now on our staff, and are hoping to develop a full-time situation. They're in the process of hiring a social work supervisor for all the social workers that are throughout Legal Aid of North Carolina. We're a statewide organization, and I'm in the Battered Immigrant Project, but we have a lot of other projects. We have over 400 attorneys statewide. We have an education project that works with children that need IEPs or individual education plans, and or may have other educational needs. We work with elderly. We have a program for elderly. So then we have social workers in those programs. And so there's in legal aid organizations, there are lots of opportunities for social workers, not just in immigration, but to supplement the work that the lawyers are doing and to provide support to their clients in an ongoing manner. So, you know, we are always looking for resources for our clients, both to provide them ongoing services of counseling and helping them connect to other needs that they may have. Maybe they need, you know, for example, I've had clients who were robbed in their apartment and no longer felt safe in their apartment, or they were sexually assaulted by a stranger in their apartment complex. They no longer felt safe in that location. So, you know, having someone who can help them find alternative housing quickly and help them, sometimes advocate for them to get out of their leases. I mean, that sometimes may involve an attorney as well. We do that sometimes when landlords are not very cooperative about allowing them to get out of their leases soon. But those are all kinds of advocacy things that we often rely on mental health counselors and social workers to assist with. And then the second aspect of that, as I mentioned, that part of the U visa is that we have to show substantial hardship, and that may be mental or physical hardship. So we regularly rely on licensed clinical social workers and licensed mental health counselors to do mental health evaluations for our clients. And those can vary from, you know, meeting with them several times just to do a general evaluation. Some, it may be that they're, you know, they meet with them 6 to 12 times and then do the evaluation to see, and then would write an evaluation that discusses specifically the mental hardship that they have suffered as a direct result of the crime. So that is something that we regularly rely on, particularly when there isn't any physical injury, because the other aspect that and this is sort of going into the advocacy a little bit, but part of the U visa requires that we get a certification by law enforcement or the district attorney's office, or I don't know if it's called the same thing, but the prosecutor's office, or the judge, or in some cases, Department of Social Services supervisors, that indicate that this client was a victim of this crime and has cooperated in the investigation of the crime. And many times I rely because I serve clients all over the state. The court advocate, there are social work court advocates that often, you know, accompany victims to court. And some of you may have had some experience in doing that. And they're the people who know the important players on the ground. They're the ones who, you know, they see the district attorney every day in court. They know the judges. They know, you know, I may know the ones right where I live, but I might have a client on the other side of the state. And that social worker is going to be the person who knows, you know, they know the police officers, they know the supervisors at DSS, or they may be, you know, they may actually work at the Department of Social Services. So I often rely on them also to help us gather that documentation that we might need for the case. And that is a situation with both U's, and then T visas are for victims of human trafficking. in the United States. The trafficking does have to occur in the United States for that visa, but there may be other visas that they qualify for if they were victims outside of the United States and who have fled here. And that includes, they may also apply for asylum. And with children who have been victims of abuse or neglect, either in their home country or here, they may qualify for something called a special immigrant juvenile visa, which allows them to get residency. And they can live with one of the parents. If the other parent is abusive, then they could still, and is not living in the home with them, they could still qualify for this special immigrant juvenile visa. And it, that's the other thing that I see. I do education with social workers and advocates to sort of issue spot. They don't have to know that, this person definitely qualifies for this type of visa, but they can say, okay, this child has been abused. They're not living with a parent. They might qualify for special immigrant juvenile. Let me call legal aid and refer them to them. And, we don't expect the social workers to know exactly what a client might qualify for, but just being able to identify that this person is undocumented and may need immigration assistance. And I know sometimes it can be hard for victims to share their immigration status. So what I would say in those situations is, letting them know that up front, these are the reasons I'm asking these questions. I know it can be hard to cooperate with police if you're afraid, if you're undocumented and you're afraid that something, that they might call immigration to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement to deport you. But I want you to know that there are options available to you, that you might be able to get a visa to allow you to stay here, to get a work permit. And if with your permission, I'd like to refer you to a legal services organization, or, there are a number of organizations in Tennessee that represent immigrants. I know Catholic Charities does, there's the Legal Aid Society does some. In Nashville, there are, I believe there's a Justice for Our Neighbors organization, which is an immigration program, nonprofit funded by the Methodist Church in Nashville as well. And I know there are a number of, and there is an immigration clinic that does some work at Vanderbilt Law School. So there are lots of options, and certainly, putting together a referral list is something that is always advisable to have on hand so that you can reach out to those organizations and refer them. And I do recommend in most cases that you contact the agencies directly initially to refer them. They may tell you that they would prefer the client to call, but I think it's always helpful to me. And I can, like with our intake, I can say, this is a direct referral from an agency. I just want you to be aware that this person's going to be calling, or can you follow up with them directly as our intake person? So, certainly that's an advocacy approach that you can take, is helping get them access to services that they might not be able to access on their own. And there may be language barriers in certain places. We have the capacity, we have fluent Spanish speakers on our staff, and our intake person is fluent and is a native Spanish speaker, but not all agencies do that. And we do have, access to language line, but that initial call, maybe if they're calling and they don't speak any English and they don't speak Spanish, or the agency you're contacting doesn't speak Spanish, then it may be also helpful to get them access. And obviously when they're in a traumatic situation, they may not even know what to ask. So being that sort of voice for them is always helpful from our perspective. because they may not know what to tell us, and they may have been going through counseling with you for a while, and you have been able to discern what's important and what's not important. And I have clients all the time that I have to draw things out of because they don't think it's important, but it's something that's very important from our perspective. And that's, I'm sorry if I'm rambling. I hope that I just want to, I like to give you sort of the idea of this is how we work with social workers and the types of cases that you might see if you're working in this environment. And I'll just stop for a minute if anybody has any specific questions.
I just had a comment, and maybe a question embedded in it, Heather. Some time back, I did some community service work with a medical mission, and we did depression screenings and some provided food to a group of women. So let me stop for a second. Is the correct terminology now undocumented, or what would be the right way to describe someone who's here without citizenship?
Yeah, well, I mean, if they have no status whatsoever, we typically use the term undocumented. And in fact, fortunately, the statutes actually for years until last year, or actually referred to them as aliens,
Yeah,
which is such an offensive term.
right. Right.
But they have, but thankfully the Biden administration has gone back and said we are no longer using that term anymore, and are going to change it in the statutes to undocumented.
Okay.
So
I just want to make sure I'm saying it correct. So
Sure.
it was about 50 women. They were all undocumented with their children. Most of their husbands or partners have been deported. And they were in a pretty big predicament where they didn't speak English. They did not have strong community liaisons. There was one woman who was trying to help them. And so a couple of things. One is I really wish I knew then what I know now, what you just said about the visa process, because there was one woman in particular whose daughter was being sexually molested by an uncle, and held over her head that she's undocumented, and if you go to the police, you'll be deported, you'll separate from your daughter. It was a horrific situation. We did obviously go ahead and get social services involved, and got some supports in there, but she was so afraid of that process, and it was heartbreaking because they were so afraid to ask for help. And they needed it beyond what any of us could possibly even imagine, right? And
Right.
so just thinking through that a little bit, I don't know if I have an exact question, but I'm glad you mentioned those options. I don't know how I would obviously express that to someone in that state of fear, because the fear is at such a high level that it's even hard for us to describe. I think it's such traumatic fear about what's going to happen next to me and my child, right? So I don't know if I can't really articulate a question, more of a concern, and like what would be your advice around handling those kind of scenarios?
Sure. I mean, one thing I would say, is sometimes if they're fearful of initially like sharing this situation, but you suspect that maybe, particularly when you had a group of like 50 women who you suspected that a number of them probably were undocumented, maybe initially, like having an advocate, a legal advocate come and do just a general presentation to all of them and say, here are options that you have. You don't have to be afraid. I always start out talking to my clients about, obviously that everything is confidential, which I'm sure you all do as well, and that we're here to help you and that we will get you any support that we can provide. And I also think that, it depends on the general atmosphere in in the country as well. So there are certain times where I feel more confident saying to my clients that, you know, there are policies in place, and there are legal policies in place. There are actual, you know, written policies in place that, and there are, in some cases, like domestic violence victims, there's actually a federal statute that has financial penalties connected to it, that if that the Department of Homeland Security cannot rely on information that solely comes from an abuser to take any negative immigration action against a victim. And there are penalties up to $10,000. And I mean, we have enforced them before. I've had to enforce them before we, and there are also policies that, you know, immigration will not go to certain places to take enforcement action, including during like if you have a client going to get a domestic violence protective order, there are policies in place that they will not take enforcement action against a victim in a courtroom. And churches are another, schools are another example. That now they don't always follow those, and especially in certain times in our country, they haven't followed them. But most of the time we can feel comfortable telling our clients that they should be safe in those circumstances. I've never seen them take enforcement action in a church. I will definitely tell you that. And not inside a school, sometimes outside of a school, but that was a rare occasion. So I think, you know, getting them access to someone saying, you know, I'd like you to talk to this attorney, and, you know, everything is confidential, and sort of giving them examples of situations that always makes them more comfortable, because every day I hear, well, my friend did this, and, you know, why can't I do that? So in that situation, it definitely is, it has the opposite effect of, you know, this client was safe, you know, we can't ever guarantee, but, and I think, you know, just starting out, I mean, it may be that you don't want to jump in with that, you know, sometimes we have clients that go through counseling for a little while before they are referred to us, and they're in a more stable situation in terms of their mental state, because although I will say that, as you say, that is their top priority. Sometimes they're very fearful of being separated from their children. They're fearful of, you know, being deported back to a dangerous situation. So I think, you know, certainly listening to the clients and what is their priority is very important. And, you know, sometimes we have to do that. Sometimes that, you know, their immigration status isn't their first priority. It's, I don't have anywhere to live. And so we have to, you know, make sure that need is resolved before we can go forward with what we're doing, because they're not going to be focused on helping in their own case if they're worried about where they're going to get their next meal or where they're going to sleep with their 3 children. So that's also where social workers are critical, because we don't, you know, we don't always have those connections of, I mean, we try the best we can, but we also don't have the time or the resource, you know, to be able to spend, you know, a whole day trying to find housing for a client. So if there are, you know, we keep resource lists, we have pages of resource lists. But, you know, that's one of the things that's been wonderful about having a social work intern that is devoted to our project, because she's able to, when we have a client that's like, I don't have anywhere to live. Okay. Here you go. Kaylee, can you help them find a place to live? Or, you know, connect them with organizations that might be able to help them with that if she's not able to do that herself. And, you know, creating resource lists for clients is just a great help. So, getting out there and meeting agencies and getting to know what their services are and who they can serve and what their criteria are for assisting is something that's really, really helpful for us as well. Because it not only benefits your immigrant clients, but they're things that you would know for any other clients that you might be serving that have those additional needs.
We have
So-
in the chat. What are some of the hardest things you have trouble finding a solution to working in immigration?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, unfortunately, I think the hardest situation is situations where someone might have a lot of barriers to becoming eligible for certain immigration benefits. For example, maybe they have an extensive criminal record because of, oftentimes it's, if it's directly related to like a trafficking situation where the trafficker forced them into prostitution or, got them hooked on drugs or forced them to sell drugs, we can overcome those in most cases. But if someone has, turned to, drug trafficking as a source of income because they, were a victim of domestic violence, unfortunately, the immigration laws are not forgiving of those situations. Now just the use of drugs, and there are waivers available for those. So that, or if they've traveled back and forth to their home country numerous times, without documentation, entered the US unlawfully numerous times, that could be a barrier. Or like the U visa requires the victims to cooperate in the investigation of the crime. So because and we have to get a certification signed by that either the police detectives who investigated it, the district attorney who prosecuted it. And now in North Carolina right now, our judges are not allowed to sign certifications, but that is not normally the case. That's just a decision, an interpretation of the law that our judicial commission took. And I think that North Carolina is the only state in the country that has that restriction, and certain supervisors of Department of Social Services in sexual abuse cases or severe child abuse cases can sign the certifications. And they're not required to sign the certification. It is voluntary, and that has been a big that is definitely something that I think causes a difficult thing for us to find a solution, because if you can run into either the person didn't cooperate the way that they wanted them to because they were afraid, like the situation, if you call the police, you're gonna get deported, so those are situations. And there are certain, that's an advocacy area that we as attorneys do, but I also think that it's a good area of advocacy for social workers, because sometimes, I will say, having practiced in both private and in nonprofit, we're in a better situation as a nonprofit attorneys to convince agency law enforcement to sign, because as a private attorney, they sometimes think that we're doing this for our own personal financial benefit and not because we're trying to really help the client. But that's again where I've relied on social workers who are familiar with the people in the community, the agencies, to help advocate for them to sign those certifications, even if the client hasn't fully cooperated. That they went to court 3 times, and then the 4th time, they couldn't miss any more work. I mean, that happens a lot, because they're often in low-income jobs that they don't have any time off. And if they miss work, they don't get paid, or they get fired. if they miss work too many times. So those situations are situations where, you know, having a social worker who might be in the courtroom on a regular basis, being able to advocate for the client as to why they weren't able to show up that day, or, you know, so, but that to me, that getting that certification signed and is definitely one of the biggest barriers that I see in terms of us finding a solution to the immigration issues, because at least for the types of cases that clients I deal with, because you can also run, like I said, it's voluntary. So you can also run into anti-immigrant law enforcement agents, which happens a lot, who says, I'm not helping this illegal get legal. They don't deserve to be here. You will hear that sometimes. And, you know, that in terms of someone, I think there was how social work students advocate for improved immigration laws. And this is sort of not just laws, but advocacy in general with, you know, doing community education programs about why people come to the United States. You know, what is the motivation? What are the circumstances from which they're coming, and how we can be more empathetic towards them, telling them, you know, one of the things that I find the most effective when you're doing any kind of advocacy is personal stories. People relate to personal stories. And, you know, I've had clients who once they're in a safe or situation and are comfortable talking about their experiences and want to, they've been some of the best advocates of working with them, of, you know, getting them to a point where they are able to advocate for the community itself. Just giving you an example about, it wasn't a law itself, but it was more of a policy change. I'm sure all of you know, like during the Trump administration, there was a major issue of separating children from their parents at the border. And I will be honest that a major reason that policy got overturned by the courts was because of advocacy of social workers, of writing, you know, testifying about the negative impact on children of being separated from their parents, the traumatic, the trauma that causes, and the ongoing negative impact that would have if they remained in the United States, of how, you know, you keep them separated. We have to find, you know, then you've got all these additional kids in foster care and we don't have enough resources in foster care or foster parents as well. Then because they don't have any of the support, they become involved in criminal activity. So those sort of things, even though that wouldn't necessarily happen, but the likely, just providing research support to legislators about the impacts, and the same thing with DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. The DREAM, you may have heard of referred to as Dreamers. And, you know, with their situation, talking about, you know, advocating about how their uncertainty of their immigration status makes it more difficult for them to succeed, and that it's in the best interest of the United States for all of these kids to succeed, because the ones that have been able to succeed have contributed immensely to our community, and that we want to ensure their success, and that it's in our best interest to ensure that their success, and stabilizing their immigration status and providing a more permanent solution is the best way to ensure that this generation contributes to our society. Because, you know, I've seen so many kids. My husband is a guidance counselor, so we have lots of conversations about, you know, how he's had kids who, you know, were so smart, but, you know, because in many states, DACA, even though they have DACA, they do not qualify for in-state tuition at colleges. And so that next step, and then if they do qualify, the fear that DACA could be ripped out from under them at any moment, then, you know, they put all this effort into this and then they're going to find themselves unemployable because they don't have status. So advocating for them about how this is so important, because these kids get depressed, that some of them have just gone back, they just went back to their home country because they felt like they had no future here. So I think that, you know, being able to share your knowledge about how that uncertainty affects them mentally, also how victims need that safety net to be able to, you know, escape the domestic violence, you know, talking, if you're working with domestic violence victims, talking about what leads victims, you know, I hear it so many, why did she go back? You know, why didn't she leave him? And I use she, but I have male victims of domestic violence clients as well, but I hear that often. And I think explaining, you know, being able to education is critical. And, you know, you're in a better position in many ways to educate legislators and policy makers about the emotional and mental effects and the ongoing effects that negative immigration laws have on children, women, communities, how it affects people economically, how it can affect your community economically in a negative way. And I do feel like I do think, even though we do legal advocacy, we actually, the American Immigration Lawyers Association actually has a national day of advocacy where attorneys from all over the country normally will go to Washington, D.C., but the last few years it's been done virtually because of COVID. They will have, you know, they train us ahead of time about what kinds of things we should be focusing on. And in some ways that's helpful, but I also think sort of joining that, doing that, you know, with non-lawyers, with social workers and mental health counselors, and, you know, advocating for the, you know, these changes and why that's so critical to a community as a whole, is important. Yes, and I would agree. It's a great opportunity for interdisciplinary collaboration. And I'm just going to try to read through. So in terms of the criminal, a deportation is not necessarily, someone asked, I don't know, that a deportation would be on someone's criminal record, and would it make it very hard to get a visa green card? It does not. On a normal criminal record, it would not show up, but it might show up if you did an FBI fingerprint check. And then there are also criminal record check, or there's not a criminal, but it's an immigration record check. There are ways to get their immigration record. And in terms of having a prior deportation, it really depends on the type of case, because fortunately for a lot of the types of cases that I deal with U visas and T visas, there is a waiver available for victims of trafficking and victim of a violent crime for a prior deportation. I mean, it's discretionary, the waiver is, but particularly if, you know, there is some, you know, they were fleeing, they were deported, but they fled back here because they had an abusive spouse. and they were fleeing that abuse. So sometimes it may depend on the situation. It also may depend on how many times they've been deported and the reason that they were deported. So if they were deported for criminal matters, it will make it harder, yes. But for, say they were caught at the border coming in without papers and didn't have any relief at that time, so they got deported immediately at the border. That's a situation where it would be less likely to have a permanent negative impact. It is always a hurdle that we have to overcome, but in many cases, delving into why they were coming, why they got deported, and why they felt the need to come back, despite having no documentation. So, and that's the other thing in terms of, collaborating with social workers. With all of these cases, we have to do a very detailed affidavit of the clients explaining their history of their, if it's an abusive relationship, if they were victims of human trafficking, how they fell into that situation, what they were forced to do. Obviously, that's a very traumatic situation of having to do that. We are regularly getting training on sort of trauma-enforced representation. I mean, trauma-focused representation. And, how to try. So a lot of times, especially in cases where I can immediately tell that a client is severely traumatized, rather than if they've gone through that whole story with a social worker before, rather than making them tell me the story again, we often, ask social workers, if the client obviously consents, to provide their notes for us that might help us create that affidavit without having to re-traumatize the clients. In other situations, we actually may have the social worker sit in with us on the interviews, or help the client write in, depending on the sophistication of the client and the how separate they are from the incident. If it happened 10 years ago versus a year, 6 months ago, where they may be maybe more traumatized still, we may actually have, depending on the client, may actually have the social worker help them write their own initial declaration, and then we would just go back in and ask them follow-up questions to fill in any gaps in their stories. But I do think, there's so many options to, for social workers to work with immigrants in the legal arena. But I definitely want to save time, and if there's anything else you want me to address specifically, I think there's just, as I said, one other thing about, sort of collaborating is, sadly, we have a lot of children, particularly in removal deportation proceedings, who have to go to court. And it is, accompanying them to court sometimes, especially because we have a lot of situations where a parent may have come years ago and then they had someone bring their child in later. They left their child behind with a grandparent or a sibling, or the other parent. And so then the parent is undocumented, but is not on the radar of immigration. So they're afraid to come to court. Because even though I have never in my 27 years had a client, knock on wood, or even seen someone else's client detained in court, at least in the courts I practice in, it's certainly a fear of coming into an immigration court when you're undocumented. So, you know, being able to have a social worker who can accompany their child into the courtroom, because and that can comfort that child while, because, you know, as the attorney, I'm talking, and it's not always easy to do both, you know, making sure that the child's okay. So that's another situation where I think, you know, social workers can definitely collaborate with lawyers to provide that emotional support in immigration proceedings. Now, the only thing I will say that is there is only one immigration court in Tennessee. It's in Memphis. So there does involve travel if you have a client from, you know, Knoxville, having to go all the way over to Memphis. But anyone that is in Tennessee has to go to court in Memphis. So Dr. Harden, are there other things you want me to address, or Sarah, or are there other questions that all of you have? I'm happy to talk some more about, you know, the work that I do and the clients that we work with.
Yeah, I know we're coming up on our hour, right, Andrea? So what about in the classroom? Anybody there that has a question or?
Well, I saw that you had a question that you posted in the comments.
It's less.
Oh, I didn't see that. Okay.
That's okay. It was just one to stir conversation. If there's some others though, certainly feel free to answer those. Mine was really about this whole categorization, I think, of people that I'm pretty confident is inaccurate, but serves a purpose politically, related to who's coming across the border and why. And that may be too long of an answer for the time we've got, Heather, but
Sure. Well, and it also brings up another point that, you know, of advocacy is that so in 2020, what happened, and, you know, I think that COVID was an excuse that was used for creating this policy, but unfortunately it remains in place right now. There is a federal law called Title 42 that allows the administration to limit entry of certain groups of immigrants due to public health concerns. And that policy has, as a result, has been utilized to prevent large numbers of people coming into the United States at the border who are seeking asylum. And unfortunately, that even includes Ukrainians who have recently arrived at the border. So what has happened as a result is there are large numbers of people waiting at the southern border on the Mexican side in horrendous conditions, waiting to come into the United States to apply for asylum, or they have applied for asylum at the border but then are having to wait until their case is heard. And those, there are so many problems with that. I mean, they definitely are not primarily cartel. They are primarily women and children and families who are seeking asylum because they're fleeing dangerous conditions in their home countries. And, you know, there are lots of, you know, it's not just, I mean, yes, there still are, as always, large numbers of Central Americans from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, but there are a lot of Venezuelans, there are Ukrainians, there are Indians. You may have heard this was actually at the northern border, but there was an Indian family that froze to death trying to come into the United States on the northern border a few weeks ago. So, so there are Afghanis. So there are people that clearly would qualify for asylum who are being forced to remain in Mexico and that creates significant barriers to access to legal representation. There are fortunately a couple of nonprofits who have placed lawyers full-time in along the southern border in Mexico, some of whom actually live on the Mexican side of the border now, who are full-time, their full-time job is helping those families. But it is definitely a misrepresentation of the reality of what is going on there. The cartels aren't going to hang out along the border. That's not where they hang out.
Right.
You know, they try to stay under the radar. They don't want people interfering with their drug trafficking. So it definitely is not the case.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think everyone probably knew the answer, but it's nice to hear it out loud, right?
Absolutely. So, and there is a lot, you know, the media with everything, there is a lot of misrepresentation about the circumstances, but.
Well, Heather, we're approaching our hour, so we just want to thank you so much for sharing with us. And, you know, this is our National Social Work Month, and, you know, the theme is the time is right. So if you could end with just one piece of advice for social workers, what would that be? You know, what is the time right for in terms of how we can better advocate for immigrants and refugees?
I think helping them be their own voice. I do think that boosting your clients up to be able to be their own voice, because I think they're the best advocates, to be honest. They can advocate better than any of us because they can tell their own story in their own words and you can feel it. I had just to finish this, because these three girls are just my favorite clients ever. In 2005, I represented 3 young girls in a human trafficking situation where their trafficker had actually legally adopted them as babies, children, and it was labor trafficking for, you know, but not versus sex trafficking. But I have now seen the, you know, and the DSS social worker who was called out to the house that night, supervisor, when they were taken out of the situation, actually ended up, the youngest one at the time was under 18 and the other 2 were 18 by that time. And she adopted the youngest one. She quit her job because they wanted to send the girls back to the trafficker's husband, who was involved in the trafficking, but was not in the United States. And that was the DSS's original plan, was to send her back, to send them back. So she adopted she and her husband adopted the youngest one, and the 2 oldest ones took them in as her family, even though she didn't legally adopt them. And they now consider her and her husband their parents. Well, those 3 girls all have now successful careers. One is 2 are married, 1 has a child, and they do speaking engagements about, you know, advocating for victims of human trafficking and working with DSS to help them understand what trafficking is. So I think helping, you know, and because of, you know, obviously they had this social worker that happened to become their mother, but I think giving them that voice is one of the best things that you can do, of giving them the courage and providing them, you know, helping them access the safety net that will allow them to eventually succeed.
Perfect.
So,
I think
but
that's
if
a great
anybody,
story. Yeah.
I will share my email address here so that if anybody wants to, if you have follow-up questions, or if you want, you know, some information about, you know, career advice about how, you know, opportunities that might be available for social workers to get involved in things, I'm happy to chat further with individual students. I love doing that. So anytime, you know, you feel free to reach out to me, but I'll put my my email here, and I'll put my cell phone number too.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for that. That's very generous of you.
And for sharing your time. Thank you so much for just sharing your time and your knowledge and wisdom. And we're all.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Like I said, this, the having social workers on staff at legal services programs has been a goal of mine since the beginning, and I'm just now starting to see it happen really on a wider basis beyond really large organizations.
Mhm. Well, thanks for rooting on social work and the collaborations, and we just really appreciate all of that.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk soon.
Yes, definitely. Yep.
All right,
All right.
take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you all for attending.